Hey there, I'm Tracy Rigdon, and this is the Contrast Project Lounge podcast. Often random, but always relevant, always real, and practically nothing is off limits. This podcast is for you. Are you ready for this? Let's do it. Welcome back to another edition of Wednesday Night Live of the Contrast Project Lounge podcast. Remember, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, X, Threads, and YouTube. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and smash all those subscribe buttons. I have joining with me tonight from the overalls community, the man in overalls himself, Mr. Nathan Ballentine. Nathan, how are you doing, sir?
Doing well. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, before we get started, I did want to tell people that may be joining us that Jim won't be joining us again this week because he is still recovering from some surgery. So I told him go ahead and take a day off, another day off, and we'd go ahead and handle it, and we'll make it work. Now, one thing, Nathan, what people may or may not know, and some people that are watching and following along with this podcast, what is the overalls community? What is it that the overalls community does?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. So what we've done is we package up a lot of ongoing support, education and resources for DIY gardeners, folks that they really want to grow their own groceries, and they want to do it themselves. They want to learn self-reliance. They want to feed their families healthier food, but they just need a little boost of education to keep them on rhythm with what they should be doing and planting each month, and then some quick reference guides and a community also support, because it's easy when you're gardening in your own yard to feel kind of like you're out there on your own.
Right.
But when you've got that community of support to trade ideas with and bounce questions off of and such like that, then you can stick with it a whole lot more. Just like folks do in different support groups, they
Sure.
are able to make big life changes. So if they've got that support in the gardening world, they end up growing a lot more food.
Don't I know it? Like I was telling you before we got started, I live way out in the boondocks. I've got a couple of acres out here, and I do have a pretty good sized garden out back. And sometimes it can be a challenge in this Florida heat. Let me tell you, my garden gets about 8 good hours of solid sun in the middle of
Nice.
in the middle of this Florida heat, and it really is brutal on some of the stuff I plant. And plus, it's sandy soil out here. So I take in all the information I can get from groups like this and the University of Florida, and wherever I can find information, and from other people out here in Middleburg that grow.
For sure.
Yeah.
Now
it's not necessarily a new concept, but it's one that's really taken off, this urban gardening and raised beds and things. Tell us a little bit about that and how you've worked your way into the backyards of people doing their own urban gardening.
Sure. So the roots of overall community is that we have been offering food garden support for over a decade now to folks who want to grow a garden, but they needed that extra leg up of someone to help them decide where a garden goes, how to design and build it out, and then perhaps some help with planting and maintenance as well. So we've been doing that for years, and I actually got inspired by a couple of neighbors around the corner from my parents' house where I grew up in Tallahassee. I grew up gardening, and I just had gardens in the ground. But there were these two ladies, one of whom was named Patty. And Patty was very type A. She had figurines in her house, and they were all dusted. And when she got started gardening, she said, I've got all this sunlight in my front yard, and I don't really want to mow that much grass. And I've got all these neighbors that have very shady yards. What if we just started a garden together in my front yard, and I'll share space, and then we can split the water bill? And the way these ladies got started was with raised beds. and raised beds felt very safe and orderly enough for Patty. And I thought, wait a second, if gardening can be packaged in such a way that it works for Patty, it's going to work for a whole lot more people. And so that was really my first major encounter with raised bed gardening, and I was like, that's good, because also when I grew up gardening, I had an ongoing contest with my father. He liked his grass, I liked my garden, and my garden would grow out into his grass, and then his mower would venture into my garden, right? Because there wasn't that clear line of division. And so the nice thing about a raised bed is it just makes very crystal clear the border between what's garden and what's yard, or what's garden and what's pathway, what have you. So when I got started with supporting people with their gardens back in 2009, so it's pushing 15 years now this September. I got started with raised beds, initially building raised beds and helping people plant them. But then over the years, we just kept listening to folks that we're working with, and they indicated that they wanted more wraparound support services.
Mm-hmm.
So we developed this, a seasonal support option where we would go back to folks' houses and kind of help them get over that seasonal hump of pulling old crop debris, deep weeding, top dressing, and replanting. And then even with things like that in place, then that little niche for the community emerged where people said, I really want to do most of it myself, but I don't know what to do. And so that's why we packaged up, doing ongoing education, not just like a single workshop, but every single month we do a workshop on what people should be planting and doing in their gardens. And that way we really can work with folks, whether they've got the resource and interest in having us back all the time in person,
Mm-hmm.
or whether they're really the DIY spirit and what they need is just a little bit of curated resources and education to keep them in the game.
That's fantastic. It really is. My sister moved up to Maryland, and she started a couple years ago, and she started with just pots and stuff like that around there. She had a small orchard in the yard that she moved to, so it was successful. But
Yeah.
she moved to the raised beds, and it's been very successful the last couple of seasons. I mean, she's just been doing real well. I haven't gone to it yet, but I am seriously thinking about it, because I got to tell you, I'm battling this sand and heat out here like crazy.
Sure. The nice thing, especially for beginning gardeners, is that if you start with a raised bed and you fill it with really good soil, then you just kind of come out of the from the get-go, you're getting good yields. Whereas, like, by all means, you can, and I do grow in the soil still, but it's kind of an uphill battle the first few years as you're fighting the weed bank and you're kind of building your soil. And so, again, it's just nice, and then also if you do it right, then you don't have many weeds to speak of for several years. So it's a really nice way to just kind of jumpstart into gardening.
Oh yeah. I'm all behind it, and plus, not only does it give people the satisfaction of growing, which I know not everybody gets it, but I mean, I've been growing these. I've got beds all over the yard with all different kinds of plants that are native to Florida, and things like that, and some tropical plants, and lots of aloe and spider plants and all kinds of stuff growing all over the yard. Well, a couple of years ago, I decided to go ahead and do the garden thing out back with a big plot. I went out there with the tractor and dug it all up, and did all the things I was supposed to do. And be honest with you, the first couple plantings I had were abysmal. The insects just devoured everything, and I got those nasty little worms on my tomatoes. It completely decimated all my tomatoes, and they wiped them out. And then I went out there and I planted a bunch of marigolds out there and a bunch of basil, and I got sage and all this stuff growing out there. They're doing good. And those bugs are still getting through. Killing me.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, but it's a lot of fun, it really is. It's a good way to spend your day. You get out there and work in the soil. But another thing too, what I was saying about, not everybody gets it and gets the thrill out of gardening, but it's also it plays into the whole mindset of just like you were saying at the beginning, people growing their own food. Well,
Hmm.
it plays also into the mindset of sustainability.
Sure.
That is a big thing. Several of the guests that I've had on the program are very big advocates of sustainability, not so much in gardening, but in overall, saving the planet and doing the things that are right um,
Sure.
for the planet. And this is such a wonderful way to, get people involved in the neighborhood. Um, Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you have something to do with some of those neighborhood type gardens in
Hmm.
what, Springfield or?
Yeah. So you might be referring to one or two things. One is for years we've worked with community gardens, whether that's like just a school garden or a
Mhm,
neighborhood allotment garden. One of the first things that I did in Jacksonville was I actually went and volunteered with the Riverside Garden when they were getting that started,
mhm,
and then we sold them a bunch of our magic mix, because one thing that irks me beyond most is when folks start wonderful community gardens, they develop a design, they get the community engaged, and then they use whatever is the cheapest, crappiest soil to fill the raised beds. And so then everyone just has a terrible experience. And all these beginning gardeners learn the lesson. Oh, yeah, I tried that once and I didn't get anything. But it wasn't their fault. It was just the fact that they were trying to grow in really lousy soil.
yeah.
So I helped them out. So I worked with community gardens for years. In Tallahassee, I helped start a youth farm, and the young folks learned how to grow and harvest and tend, but then also cook. And then they learned all the related skill sets and information around like composting and power tools and soil science and predator prey relations and such like that.
Mhm,
So I've been involved with community garden and urban agriculture in many regards for over a decade.
mhm,
But then in 2018, we started an experiment called Overall's Farm, and now we've got two operational locations, and we're working on the third. And the way that works is it's a subscription you pick. So people pay a monthly fee like Netflix, and then they
mhm,
can come pick whatever it is they want whenever they please. And that way, as farmers, we don't have to harvest and go to market. And if you're a customer, you don't have to wait for market day. You also don't have to pay marginal cost, right? Like, so if you want extra broccoli because your in-laws are in town, you just take extra broccoli, right? Or if you decide, I want to make a big salad tonight, then you don't have to buy an extra head of lettuce. You just harvest an extra head of lettuce and you take it with you. So the
mhm,
way we regulate to make sure there's enough is that we limit the total number of family members per farm, and that way we keep it in balance where we know that there's always going to be like 10 different herbs and 10 different veggies ready to harvest. And you might not be able to count on one specific crop,
mhm,
but you know that you can always come to the farm and get something for dinner or your lunch and such. So we started that project in 2018, and it was really an experiment. I mentioned the youth farm. So the beautiful thing about the youth farm in Tallahassee was the way it engaged and transformed these young people. So they, like I mentioned, they learned all these skills. I remember when we were first getting started, um, I was riding around the truck with a couple of these young ladies, and I was trying to tease out what we should grow in order to kind of match what they liked to
mhm.
eat. And I asked them, so what kind of vegetables do y'all eat? And they conferred with each other, and then they looked back at me and said, no, we don't really eat vegetables. I was like, what? Like, how can you not eat any vegetables? I said, well, when's the last time you had a vegetable? And they talked amongst themselves again, and then they turned to me and they said, yeah, we had a salad from Zaxby's sometime last week.
Right.
And I just thought like, oh, wow, like this right here in a nutshell is the state of American health, right? Is
Yeah.
like, this is why all of these chronic diseases that used to be called things like late onset diabetes, they had to change the names of them to type 2 diabetes now, because
Right.
all of our diets have just collectively gotten so bad that we're getting all these diet related chronic diseases. So I saw that and I was like, okay, so here's where we're at. That was kind of where we started. Fast forward 8 months in, and the young folks, they participated every week in preparing food from the farm, and then we had a big meal together. And so 8 months in, we had this day where we didn't get to go grocery shopping beforehand. So the kids showed up and they said, well, what are we going to cook? And I said, well, we didn't go grocery shopping, so we don't have anything to cook. And these young people, they just all stared me down and looked at me like I was crazy. And they said, well, we could at least make a salad. And I was like, wow, like these are the same young people that 8 months ago told me that they didn't eat vegetables,
Right.
So that was really beautiful, right? And like I mentioned, it was awesome watching these young people who were middle and high schoolers. They would receive college volunteers at their farm, and they would educate the college students on things like microbiology of a compost pile, or how to use a power saw safely, right? And it's like just this awesome turning of the tables on traditional like who knows things kind of seesaw, and that was beautiful. But where the farm sort of failed was that we didn't really feed the neighborhood. In order for the farm business to work, we had to either export produce or import customers. And a lot of that just had to do with the market days. So we had market days on Monday and Friday afternoons because that's when the kids were there. But it turns out everybody works on Monday and Friday afternoons. So those markets really only worked for folks that were, retired, mostly not from the low-income community where we were. And when I got to Jacksonville and I was thinking about starting another urban farming project, I thought somehow we've got to grow this food in the neighborhood for the neighborhood itself, and B, somehow we've got to make this produce as readily available as the junk food is at the corner store.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know how we were going to do that. For a while, I played with ideas around like a vending machine for vegetables. But I thought the problem there is that if any of the produce starts looking bad in the vending machine, then the story just gets around like, oh yeah, they've got that gross, nasty vegetables in a vending machine. Like that's a bad story. So I was wrestling with it, and there's a few other steps along this road, but ultimately what made something click was when IKEA opened in town, and I went, within that first week with the whole city, and they had these pallets of books called the IKEA Story. It was like the biography of the founder of IKEA. So I picked one up and I was like, well, I'll read that. I like reading biographies. And in this book, this guy tells the story of how like IKEA really found their key to success when they were watching their customers and they realized that they were like taking furniture apart in order to fit it in their cars. And so he said, like, wait a second, why don't we just not assemble the furniture? We'll manufacture it, but then we'll box it. And that way it can fit in people's vehicles. And as a result, they saved something like 50% of their manufacturing costs, 60% of their shipping costs, and a lot of floor space and headache. And, they saved us a step too, right? Yeah. But it was this breakthrough because what they did is they basically passed along the savings to their customers for doing part of the work. And I thought, could you do that with produce? Could you transform this idea of harvest as labor into harvest as experience? And then because effectively we're saved from doing 50% of the labor of harvest, washing, packing, marketing,
Sure,
selling,
sure.
could we not limit how much people get, so that healthy food becomes marginally free, whereas like every extra herb or vegetable that people take, there's no extra cost to that. So it was an idea, and what we did is we just ran it in parallel with a few other business models, and it kept winning. So we kept doing it, and it took us almost 2 years to admit it to ourselves and just said like, no, this is what we're gonna do. And it was probably a year and a half in. We had 10 members, and then quickly we jumped to 20, 25 members. And now the interest is just crazy. We've got 350 families from across Jacksonville on our wait list, waiting for us to start a farm in their
Wow.
neighborhood.
Wow.
So we're trying to live into that. We've got over 100 families right here in Springfield that are waiting on Farm 3, and then we'll move on to trying to serve these other hundreds of families.
That's incredible. And that does lead me into what I was going to ask you about before. And it's not just a hobby. You've taken something that you love, a hobby, growing up, gardening, and you've turned it into a thriving business that benefits the people.
Trying to, yeah.
All good, all good. I think it's a fantastic thing. Now, well, I was going to mention too, you had said something about having, you had days out there at some of those gardens where, kids were out there, or some of the college kids were out there, or, that kind of thing. You know, a learning experience, as you said, a learning experience, and something that is good for the whole family in all reality. One of our previous guests, Val Herman, was mentioning that, and you know her.
Yeah.
She was doing the same thing on a small scale, small, kind of garden, and including families, and those are it's a family affair, and they do the same thing. They're teaching the kids, not only the gardening and the cooking and the stewardship of having a garden, but also, like you mentioned too, the tools, learning those tools that they use in the garden. And that's something that some kids may not get at home unless they were to attend something like this. And it's also something that they'll carry with them for the rest of their life.
Certainly. Yeah, my father used to talk about how one of the ways in which cultures maintain survival skills, is through different hobbies and crafts. And so things like knitting and canning and gardening and sewing and things
Sure.
like these life skills that are very important, and they're incredibly resilient skills to big system disruption, right? And most of the time, in modern society, we maintain those skills as a what if, or just because people are passionate about it and they're interested in them. Another preservation of these skills is sports, right? Like, can you run fast? Can you throw a javelin? And all those things go back to very primitive skill sets of like,
Sure.
can you chase down an antelope, right? Can you spear the animal? Can you hunt, right? But we maintain them in these different cultural forms that kind of like package them up and make them palatable to the modern audience. But
Sure.
if and when these modern systems break or shake, then we have them to rely on. And I think that it's so important. Things like how do you do things with your hands, right? Even power tools, right? So many folks are wildly dependent upon the other person, right?
Yes.
But having some of these skill sets mean that if you have a localized system disruption, right, in your life, in your family's life, in your neighbors, in your neighborhood, in your city, because of a disaster, what have you, if you have those skills, then you can dust them off and put them to use, even if the next week you don't need them again, and that's okay.
Right.
But it's really important for societies and communities to maintain a certain level and a certain dispersal of those um, basically primitive basic skills of
Sure.
life, so that we hold on to them and continue to pass them down.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I know that there are several. There's I wouldn't say several, but there's a couple of large. I'm not going to say farm, but they're good sized gardens out here in I'm in Clay Hill, Middleburg, and there's some of my neighbors have some pretty good sized gardens, and they actually do have
Mm,
it. I see people out there in their garden all the time, and it's not like an advertised thing or anything like that. But I see kids
mhm,
out there in the garden all the time. Some of them I know that they're,
mm.
grandchildren and that kind of thing. But the kids are out there pushing a wheelbarrow around, collecting horse manure out of the stalls,
Sure.
and working in the garden. And I just think it's fantastic.
Hmm.
I love it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's important, and that's some people will, going back to raised bed garden for a minute. Folks that are curious about sustainability, they'll say, well, raised bed uses so many resources, right? You have to bring in this lumber, you have to bring in soil, you moved it there with a truck. And to me, a raised bed garden is a way of preserving a skill and maintaining it and keeping it palatable so that a lot of folks can get exposed to growing food.
Hmm.
Because the truth of the matter is once you learn how to garden in a raised bed, if you need to adapt that skill to a bigger area, you can, right? Because you already, the more important thing is you've learned how to plant things, you've learned how to make sure they get enough water, you've learned how to watch them and kind of see what they need.
Hmm.
And all those skills are transferable, whether you're growing in a container or a raised bed or in the ground. And so to me, it's really important getting kind of getting as many people as possible to hold on to those skills and cultivate them
Hmm.
so that again, just the if and when we need them, then we've got them. And if and when looks different. So I grew up on stories from my grandmother of the Great Depression,
Hmm.
and my mom telling stories about taking her shoes off when she got home from school to save them from wear so that she didn't have to buy as many, right? Because they were poor.
Right.
Um, and so it might look like that again, some kind of Great Depression, but it may just look like the chronic disease epidemic that we're living in, right? Or all these
Right.
different environmental ills that are happening. I've read that there's like 10,000 synthetic chemicals that didn't exist before about 1940 that we regularly consume as part of our American diet, right?
Hmm.
And all of our bodies are expressing that toxicity in all kind of different ways, right? So is it expressing itself as a peanut allergy or a gluten intolerance or is IBS or cancer or diabetes? I think all of the above is true, right? I think our systems are
Sure.
just so taxed right now, and so there is this crisis that's happening, but it's the frogs in the pot of boiling water, right? And it's
Hmm.
just been slow coming on for like 60 years. So when we look around, we think this is normal, but it's far from it. If you compare with some other places around the world where there's less toxicity in the food, um, I mean, one of my wake up calls was I worked out in Montana in the national park, and there were all these international students, about 100 international students that worked with us for the summer, and then they went home. Almost every single one of them talked about how the food made them sick, and I thought, oh well, that's just because you're adjusting. If I went to your country, I would feel the same way for a few months. Well, then after that summer, my wife and I went traveling and we spent time in Central and South America. We spent time in Europe and I didn't feel the reverse. But when I came home, I got sick again.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my gosh, it's our food, right? Our food is poisoned on a regular basis.
Hmm.
And so anyhow,
Sure.
so I think gardening and growing your own food and learning how to prepare and cook, these are survival skills for negotiating the current American food system. that is applicable and helpful right now, because
Sure.
kind of every bite that you can take that you can trust is a bite that'll help repair and regenerate your body, as opposed to something that might be kind of tearing it down. So
Oh yeah, that brings to mind, people like you said, people are dependent on also dependent on going to the grocery store for
yeah,
everything.
for sure.
And practically, when you go to a grocery store, a large supermarket like Publix or Winn-Dixie or Aldi's or what have you, anything, the produce section, it's like nothing ever goes out of season,
Right.
because they're shipping things in there on a consumerist, you know fed system. People want to have tomatoes every single day of the week, or every week when they go to the grocery store. So that grocery store is going to have tomatoes from somewhere.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating reality, and it's really just a giant experiment that we're living through right now, where
Mhm.
the food system knows that we are motivated by bright colors. Um, it's why candies are all these different colors, right? Because we're drawn to berries and things like that because they have lots of vitamins and minerals and all these flavonoids and polyphenoids and things like that. Um, that's also true of the fruits and vegetables, right? Necessarily.
Sure.
That's why those colors alert our human eyes that something's ready to harvest, right? It's been kind of a muddled green or something, and then it flashes bright red or blue or purple or pink or whatever, and then that's the cue, like, oh, I'm going to pick that, I'm going to eat it. It's going to be sweet. It's going to be delicious. But the trick is that we've actually kind of like lost the baby with the bathwater, because we've so focused on things that look good and that transport well and will look good on a grocery store shelf, that we've sacrificed nutrition and taste along the way.
Mhm.
So we've got
Oh yeah.
tomatoes that look beautiful, right? But you slice them and eat them, and you're like, this just tastes like water, right? And
Yeah.
if you do nutrient analysis, it's equally deficient. One thing that's just fascinating. So I had a buddy in Tallahassee, and he did these uh, research studies where he would compare the taste preference of vegetables, and then he would take them to the lab and use a spectrometer to kind of measure their vitamin content. And almost without fail, every time, if you had a group of at least about 20 people do a taste test, the one that most people preferred was the one that was more nutritious. And so you could actually determine nutrition just based on does it taste good, um,
Sure.
which is telling in the grocery store. Is like, if instead of just looking at the produce, if we were actually allowed to like wash and taste it, it would change a lot of stuff in what was
Sure.
actually sold to us.
Sure. So, so going into the future, like we started off the
Hmm.
program, it's not really a new trend, but the trend is kicking off, and probably a good idea that it's picking up, just like we've been talking about. The way things could, happen with our food chain could fall apart. We could go into a
Hmm.
depression. Not that we're all sitting here, being doomsdayers, but you know,
Sure.
uh, but going into the future, how do you see uh, people like yourself and the overall community? How do you see people like yourself that are doing the same thing, going out and teaching the
Hmm.
community? How do you see that movement progressing as we go forward in this economy mess that we're in?
Sure. I see it developing both in economic and I guess economic, cultural, and political ways.
Hmm.
So I think about, on an economic um, standpoint, what I see is that there's this emerging ecosystem of leaders and small businesses that are making available an alternative to the industrial chemical agricultural system. Um, and um, and we are, by and large, folks are doing things on a really tiny level, but it's almost like we're practicing, right? And we're also
Mhm.
linking up, and we're learning how to do things like hire a team and raise funding and interconnect our enterprises, right?
Sure.
It's all these little economic things that you see on a much larger scale, but we're just small right now, right? And some of that, the beauty of it is that it's small, and so it's very responsive to the local level. But some of the things we're doing can scale, and they can replicate in such a way as to make bigger impact. And
Mhm.
what I see is that whole economic ecosystem of alternative food systems blossoming. I think that there's going to be a huge amount of innovation, or at least there's opportunity for a lot of innovation around trusted food systems.
Mhm.
And I think that those will range from like neighbor to neighbor to the scale of like possibly blockchain tracked foodstuffs that can track the inputs of what was put on it. So you know that if you're eating bread that says wheat on the package, you're actually just eating wheat and not like 57 agricultural chemicals that was sprayed on that wheat. Um, so I see that happen. I see economic innovation and interconnectedness emerging just across the whole world, actually, but from the local level up. On a political sphere, I think that there's this growing discourse around the toxicity of the food system and just like misplaced incentives all over the place around. We have allowed our regulatory systems to be captured by the chemical agricultural companies that are killing us. A great example of
Mhm.
this right now is that Monsanto and similar companies, they are actively trying to pass these immunity bills at the state level, and now they're trying to put it into the farm bill at the national level to insulate them from any legal repercussions from the chemicals that they put on our food. So it'll be like the vaccine companies are immune from any legal action against them. It'll be like that, but for agricultural chemicals. And I think just the outrageous amount of health consequences of these chemicals, people are growing aware of that, and there's going to be a pushback against that. And we need um, the political mobilizing to change that tide,
Yeah.
um, and create things like right size regulation and regulation that emphasizes clean, healthy, natural kind of foods as opposed to chemically laced addictive foods.
Right.
And then
Right.
on this cultural front, I think that I think there's a lot of opportunity for the enjoyment and the sharing of food.
Mhm.
And I think that you're seeing this with the rise of different craft artisan kind of things like sourdough bread, bakeries,
Yeah.
and I mean craft
Yeah.
beer, right? For the past
Yeah.
20
Yeah.
years has been kind of this, and where I think things will get really interesting and dynamic is where you get these intersections of the economic ecosystem with the cultural piece and the political piece where you say like, well, hey, look, I want to go to a local brewery, but I want it to have the beer to be made from grain that I know isn't going to poison me, right?
Mhm.
And and while we're there, then let's have conversations about the politics that would make it so that we can more easily eat clean, you know,
Mhm.
things like that. And how do we do all this in such a way that that our whole communities eat well? Because if you've got a certain segment eating well, their lives are going to continue to be adversely affected by this large population that's eating poorly, because they're going to be dealing with like more mental health and more crime and more volatility and things of that nature. So what I love about food is that it's common to us all.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of different issues where it's easy to kind of think about it in silos, but you start thinking about food and the repercussions of folks not having enough or nutritious enough food, and people get that it's important for you to take care of yourself and your family and your your circle of care, but people tend to also understand the importance of doing what we can in through our different personal and political systems to make sure that other folks are eating well too, because otherwise it just gets
Sure.
messy.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Nathan. I thank you so much for joining me. Before we go, how can our friends, fans, and followers get in touch with you at the Overalls community?
Yeah, so you can find our overalls community website at overalls.community. And that's it. There's no .com, nothing. It's just www.overalls.community. Or you can track me down on any of the social medias
Mm-hmm.
at Man in Overalls, and I'll point you in the right direction.
Sounds great. Once again, thanks for joining me, Nathan.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. It's been a good conversation. Have a good evening.
Well, that's a wrap. Another fantastic episode of the podcast. You can find us on all the social media platforms, wherever you surf, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter X, Threads, wherever. Don't forget to like, share, and comment. And on our YouTube channel, don't forget to like, share, comment, and smash that subscribe button. If you're streaming audio for the podcast, you can find us wherever you get your favorite podcast programs. In the meantime, I like to tell everybody, take care of yourselves and each other. Until next time, peace.